Hi everybody, Jennifer Schaus here coming to you live from Washington, DC, and thank you for joining us in our Webinar Wednesday series. 2022, which is this year, we are covering the FAR supplements. We've got a lot of great guest speakers who are going to be working with us to present the material. But first, a quick blurb about us. We are based in downtown DC and provide consulting services for established businesses, product, service, and software firms that are selling their solutions to the federal government. Some of our services are listed here. First and foremost, GSA schedules, and also the other services that are mentioned here. You can find more about us on our website. And also just to let you guys know, you probably found out about this webinar through our newsletter, which now reaches over 23,000 government contractors. We do have advertising options available in the newsletter. We now have, I believe we're up to, today will be our 505th webinar. They're all obviously on our YouTube channel and complimentary. If you're having trouble finding anything on the YouTube channel, you can go to our website, click on the tab that says webinars, and they're all segmented by topic. We do have sponsorship and advertising options available in our webinars. You can also put on your own webinar with us, and that's a series that we run on Thursdays. If you want information about that, just shoot us an email at hello@jenniferschaus.com, and we'll circle back with you. So about this series in 2022, what we did cover in 2020 was the FAR, all 52 parts, and then last year in 2021, we covered the DFARs. This year's the FAR supplements, and we're taking it from the top. So we started with an overview. Today we're going to dig into DPGI. And as you guys know, most of our webinars are complimentary, they're recorded. And our speakers are subject matter experts and government contracts attorneys and others. This is the full schedule, so it'll take us through the end of August. Today, as you can see, February 2nd, DPGI. And then we continue on through most of DOD and then some of the other agencies and departments. What happens then on Fridays is the corresponding playbook, which is more of a sales, marketing, and business development perspective on the agencies. So we've got our friends over at FedMine who are providing information on upcoming bidding opportunities. The folks over at the McLean Group will cover any sort of M&A activity, mergers and acquisitions, which are happening within the top vendors within those agencies. And then we usually have somebody from the government side, the small business office, who will talk about any upcoming events, matchmaking, any of their mentor-protege programs, these sort of activities that are happening within the department or agency. So as you can see, DPGI does not have obviously a corresponding playbook, but last Friday we did cover DOD. That's on our website. It's been recorded. You can download that complimentary. Quick shout out to our sponsors. We want to thank the Virginia PTAC. They're the Procurement Technical Assistance Center housed over at the George Mason University. They provide one-on-one counseling and training for aspiring government contractors. You can jump on their website to grab information about any of their events and any sort of training programs that they offer. You can also call them directly. They're very helpful. We appreciate their partnership in this. We also want to thank our other sponsor, the Federal Business Council. Federal Business Council for the last, I believe, 40 years has been putting on virtual and in-person events, sometimes housed at the various agencies and departments, and other times over at the convention center where they have the annual procurement fair. You can jump on their website, which is fbcinc.com, or give them a call at the 240-841-2210 phone number. Okay, as we mentioned, this year we are covering the FAR department supplements, covering defense. We've got Janetta Brewer with us. She has spoken for us in the past, and I know she's got some great information because I took a sneak peek at her slides. So Janetta, I'm gonna turn the floor over to you. I'm gonna put myself on mute and just let me know when you're ready for your next slide.
Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate you having me here. So I'm actually very excited about the topic we're going to be talking about today. I actually used to work within DOD, within DARS, which is the Defense Acquisition Regulation System. And in that role, I led teams who were responsible for drafting changes to the FAR DFARS and the DFARS PGI. So I'm super excited to share my knowledge and background with you guys related to the DFARS PGI, which many non-DoD folks don't have a lot of background and knowledge on, but it is a document that is full of a lot of valuable information, whether you're in the government space or on the industry side of the house. Next slide, please. So I think it's always helpful to set the stage first before kind of diving into a topic. So I think background and context is super important for most anything. So first I want to provide kind of a big picture view of the environment responsible for kind of developing and maintaining the DFARS PGI. And then we can jump into discussing what is the DFARS PGI, why was it created, what does it contain, how is it useful for industry and government, contracts professionals. So we'll kind of talk through all of that today. So the DFARS PGI is a guide that was developed and maintained by the Department of Defense. Within the Department of Defense sits the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and this office has responsibility for overseeing the Defense Department, and it also acts as a principal defense policymaker and advisor. So if you think of all of the various policies that are kind of being created and sorted throughout DoD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense has the primary responsibility for developing and maintaining those. It's called OSD. So within OSD, you have different divisions. And each of those divisions have a division of responsibility, usually based on a topic area. So if you think about acquisition policy, government contracts, that all falls within one office, and that's the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense. Used to be Acquisition Technology and Logistics, which is the ATNL listed here. But recently that was changed to the Office of Acquisition and Sustainment. And so under that undersecretary, you have Defense Pricing and Contracting, and then under Defense Pricing and Contracting, you have these these four directorates that are showing at the bottom of that org chart. And DARS is the one that specifically has responsibility for developing and maintaining the DFARS and the DFARS PGI. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, under the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, you have Defense Pricing and Contracting, who has responsibility for all pricing and contracting policy matters across all of DoD. DPC, they execute statutes, executive orders, policies. They're responsible for business systems and standards. So if any of you guys previously have responsibilities associated with Service Contract Act reporting, for instance, there's a big DoD rule that came out recently where DoD started using SAM. This organization is the one who was responsible for developing that new guidance and guidelines and coordinating with implementing the new SAM requirements for that reporting. DPC empowers the DoD contracting community with resources. So it's not just enough to issue regulations, the FAR and the DFARS that you're requiring contracts folks to follow. They also issue a lot of guidance and additional information to help support the contracting officers in being able to implement those regulations in accordance with the various laws and responsibilities. Next slide, please. Within Defense Pricing and Contracting, you have several directorates. As I mentioned before, you have 4. All of these directorates work very closely together. Contract policy, the first one that's listed there, they're responsible for developing policy objectives as it relates to any acquisition-related topic across DoD. And they work closely with a POC from each of those teams that are listed below, because to the extent that a policy needs to be implemented via a regulation, so if it's something that is going to have widespread responsibility across all of DoD, for instance, if it's a policy being implemented that a contractor is going to have to follow, and therefore a clause is going to have to be developed for contracting officers to put into a contract, that contract policy POC is going to work with the DARS, the Defense Acquisition Regulation System POC, to help support the development of the regulatory language that would support DoD's policy position in an area. Next slide, please. And so then within DARS, the Defense Acquisition Regulation System, you have a group of folks who have responsibility for developing and drafting proposed changes and final changes to both the FAR, which they do in coordination with the Civilian Acquisition Council, the DFARS, and the DFARS PGI. So within the DAR Council, you have the chair, who is a DoD OSD employee. You have the DARS director, and then the director oversees a team of folks who consist of representatives from each of the departments within DoD. You have the Army represented, you have the Navy represented, you have the Air Force represented, and then you also have DCMA, DLA, and NASA represented. But NASA typically won't speak on matters that solely relate to DoD. So when you're talking about changes to DFARS and changes to the DFARS PGI, typically NASA will recuse themselves from those conversations. They typically only participate to the extent that conversations are around changes to the FAR. So as you see, to the extent that any change is made to the DFARS or the DFARS PGI, the representatives from all of these departments are at the table and representing the impact that they think that change will have on the contracts professionals and on industry within their various departments. Next slide, please. So you have a group of folks within DARS. You have this team that's responsible for implementing kind of the DFARS and the DFARS PGI. The authority for them to be able to make those changes is actually established within the FAR. So the FAR system was established for the codification and publication of uniform policies and procedures for acquisition by all executive agencies. So obviously across all of the government, there's this desire to have standardization and uniformity in how contracts acquisitions are made, and to ensure that across the federal government, contracting officers are procuring goods and services and implementing requirements within contracts pretty similarly. This is obviously great for the federal government as a whole. It allows contracts professionals to move between agencies. It ensures that everybody has a standard and consistent understanding. It ensures that executive desires and missions that are incorporated within statutes and executive orders, that they're applied consistently across the board. And it also helps industry understand at a big picture level what the responsibilities are. So if I'm doing work with DoD, I'm not going to encounter something differently, drastically differently, if I'm doing work with the Department of Homeland Security. So that standardization is great across the board. But there's also an understanding that each of the executive agencies have very vastly different responsibilities. Department of Homeland Security's responsibilities is very different from the responsibilities of Department of Treasury, for instance. And their responsibilities at Department of Treasury is very different from the responsibilities within the Department of Interior, who has responsibility for kind of maintaining the landscape across the US. So because of these differences in missions, it's understood that the types of contracts that the various mission departments or executive agencies will be entering into are also likely to be very different. And the type of work that contractors will be performing will also be very different. And so therefore, it's likely that those different agencies will need their own set of guidance and instructions to support the different nature of contracts that their executive agencies will be responsible for. And so because of that, within FAR 1301, it allows authorization for an agency head to issue their own set of agency acquisition regulations that implement or supplement the FAR and incorporate together with the FAR and policies, procedures, clauses, solicitation provisions, and forms. It's giving them the authority to create those that are unique and specific for their agency. Next slide, please. So you have the authority granted within the FAR that allows the various executive agencies to create their own set of procurement instructions. And so the Department of Defense established the DFARS, and then later the DFARS PGI. So the DFARS, established for the codification and publication of DoD acquisition regulations, so apply across the board to all DoD contracts professionals. But the DoD is not a standalone document. It has to be read in conjunction with both the FAR and the DFARS PGI. So you'll have executive agency-wide across all of the federal government regulations stipulated within the FAR. And then you go to the DFARS to figure out, okay, and now what additional set of criteria do I have to follow? Or how is what's described in the FAR changed or tweaked within the DFARS? And then I also need to go to the PGI to see what type of implementing type of instructions, what types of guidance may be available, what types of forms I may be required to use as a contracting officer. So it's important that within DoD, contracts professionals are reading the DFARS PGI. It has to be read with the FAR and the DFARS. The PGI is a result of a DFARS transformation that was chartered by the Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition and Technology and Logistics many years ago. As part of the transformation, they were trying to streamline the regulations in the DFARS. So they wanted to take all of the things that were not mandated by law or mandated by DoD policy and put those within the PGI. So if it's just internal instructions that we're trying to use to help contracting officers implement, regulations and statutes, then those would be within the PGI, and to maintain just in the DFARS level, those things that are required by law, DoD-wide policy, other delegations of authority, any deviations from the FAR, and policies that have a significant impact outside of DoD's internal operations. But anything pretty internal to DoD, not mandated by statute or executive order, that sets of instructions would be maintained within the PGI. So the DFARS, if you want to kind of think of a big picture, DFARS will answer the question, what's the policy? Like, what's DoD policy in a subject area? What are the rules that I have to follow? And rules meaning both on the government and the industry side. What are the rules that I have to follow? And then the DFARS PGI would connect the contracting officer and industry with related background, procedures, guidance. How do I execute the policy? Why does this policy exist? That type of information would be found within the PGI. Next slide, please. So again, PGI is a central access point for all of this information. And this is a definition that is maintained within the DFARS. The PGI, it has mandatory internal DoD procedures. So within the DFARS, if you're reading kind of the regulations there, you may have language that says, follow the procedures at, and then it'll stipulate kind of where in the PGI the contracting officer should go to in order to kind of carry out further the policies that are stated there. It also contains non-mandatory internal DoD procedures and guidance and supplemental information. And that kind of language will be captured in permissive language, such as the contracting officer may use or additional information is available at. So DoD has a wealth of information, guides, handbooks, templates, forms, information that's developed by the different departments and agencies. And so oftentimes that information will be made available within the PGI so that folks will have access to it who find it helpful. The PGI is numbered similarly to the DFARS. So if it's 202.102 DFARS, if it's DFARS 202.102, that language where it says, follow the procedures at, it's going to be PGI, same numbering associated with it. And it's also available electronically at this website that's listed here. Next slide, please. So here I wanted to show if you have an interest in actually accessing the PGI, where it's located. So within the Defense Pricing and Contracting website, they list the DFARS and the PGI. I find this to be, if you actually have an interest in researching language in the DFARS and the PGI, there are other websites that will have the information available, but this is DoD's official site. So when, the DARS Council, when they're making changes to the DFARS and PGI, this is where they are publishing the information. They're not publishing it on the other websites that are maintained by other individuals or companies. So my recommendation is that if you have an interest in actual language, that you go to this site, because this is the site that is actually maintained by DoD. And as you'll see, it's pretty structured similarly to the FAR. You'll have the DFARS columns, and then you'll have the PGI columns. So to the extent that you have PGI language associated with the DFARS language, they're provided there together so that you're able to kind of research them and get that information together at the same time. Because again, they're meant and intended to be read together. Not the DFARS is not a standalone document, and neither is the DFARS PGI. So you can go to this website if you have an interest in finding the DFARS and DFARS PGI. You'll also have within DoD any class deviations that DoD has issued. You could also find those from this site, and you could also find any publication notices. So to the extent that there are new changes to the DFARS and the DFARS PGI, you can go to this website to find those as well. In the slides that follows, I'm actually going to kind of walk you through some of the most recently published PGI cases. I think it's important for everybody to know. I'm not going to go through each, subpart of the FAR and DFARS to talk you through kind of what's contained in the PGI, because that would take a lot longer than what we have time allocated for during this presentation. But I do want to help you understand what's the value of a PGI, especially if you're on the industry side of the house. Why do you care, to go and research the PGI? So I'm going to walk you through some of the recent changes that were made to the DFARS PGI so that you can get an idea of how these changes will likely impact you on the industry side. And so to the extent that you want to stay on top of those, which I highly recommend, because the regulatory space as it relates to the DFARS and the FAR, it changes all the time. So it's really important to stay on top of any changes that are happening. And so this will help you kind of understand where to go to do that, to find that information and how those changes are likely to impact you. Next slide, please. So on the previous slide, I showed you there's a link that says that, that DFARS publication notices. If you click on that publication notices hyperlink, it'll take you to this page. And this page is a listing of all of the changes that have been made to the DFARS and the DFARS PGI. And as you'll see on this page, it'll show you, for instance, here it says, proposed rule, non-commercial software, non-commercial computer software. And then all the way at the bottom, it'll say, Microsoft Word format document showing the DFARS change and the DFARS PGI changes that are proposed to be made. So within this listing, if it's a proposed rule, meaning the government is notifying you that it intends to make a change to the DFARS or DFARS PGI, you can find the language for both the DFARS and the DFARS PGI language there. And then if they issue a final rule, meaning they've already notified you, they've gotten your public comments, and now they're actually making the final change to the regulation, that information and language will be there as well. And over to the right, you see the archived publication notices. If you have any interest in going back in time to understand, why do we have a mandatory disclosure rule, for instance, or why did DoD decide that it wanted to, no longer maintain service contract reporting separately and it wanted to go, with the federal-wide approach. All of that information will be contained within that archive publication notices section. Next slide, please. So over the next few slides, as I mentioned, DFARS is a dynamic, ever-changing set of instructions. What's there today, if you check a year from now, likely could be different. So it's important to stay on top of the changes that are happening. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to just talk through some of the recent changes that were made so that you can understand the value of the guidance that's contained within the PGI. So on this one, we have a recent publication that's peer reviews of contracts for supplies and services. So essentially, DoD is issuing a rule. They're amending the DFARS and the DFARS PGI to update policies and dollar value thresholds for the conduct of peer reviews that happen within the Office of the Principal Director of Defense Pricing and Contracting. And it also clarifies what type of contract actions have to go through a peer review. This did not require to go through public comment because it's really just changing DoD's internal review processes, and it doesn't really have a significant impact on industry. But why would you care from an industry standpoint about DoD peer reviews? Well, you care because you want to know, like we all have an interest in new solicitations that are going to hit the street and when awards are going to be made. And so DoD has kind of internal processes that they have to follow before a new solicitation can be issued and before an award can be made. And one of the items within the process is a peer review. So if I know and understand that if I have an acquisition that I'm going out after that is projected to exceed the threshold that's required for a peer review, then I know for this solicitation, more than likely, because it exceeds this threshold, it's going to have to go all the way up to the Director of Defense Pricing and Contracting at the Office of the Secretary of Defense level to be reviewed before the solicitation can be issued and before an award can be made. So for me, I understand now, because this decision-making authority isn't just within the contracting officer's purview, that it's probably going to be a longer time before that solicitation hits the street and before the award hits the street. Because if it's a decision that can just be made at the contracting officer level, then that's something obviously that can be made pretty speedily. When the contracting officer gets all of the proposals, they can review them, and however long it takes them to review the proposals and make a decision, they can make an award. But if it's something that requires peer review, that can't happen. It's going to have to go through 3, 4, 5, 6, sometimes layers within DoD before it gets to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, who has to then review it. And so it helps me as an industry person to have better insight into what's the administrative process that the contracting officer is going to have to follow when for this specific acquisition. And it helps you from a planning and timeline perspective. So that's why this type of information would be helpful for, say, someone on the industry side of the house to have information about. Next slide, please. Another recent PGI publication is related to ground flight and risk. For the others, I'm not going to provide a whole lot of information about it, but I just want to help people kind of know, again, different types of rules that are coming out and how they impact you. So obviously, with the impact of COVID and social distancing that everybody is wanting to follow, there are a lot more government contracts for personal aircraft. So if you're a company who provides flight services to the federal government as a customer, then this rule would obviously have a direct impact on you. And so it'll be important for you to know and understand what's in the rule and how the contracting officer is projecting to analyze, especially as it relates to this share of loss, which is increasing from $100,000 to $200,000. So on the industry side of the house, this is extremely important information if I'm in, a field where I'm providing those types of flight services to the federal government, where I'm renting aircraft or renting plane services to the Department of Defense, or if I'm, in an associated industry where I'm supporting those companies that do. So maybe I do maintenance for a company that's providing flight services for DoD, for instance. So this is another example of just a type of a rule that recently has a change or an update. Next slide, please. This next one is on guidance on the criteria for the use of lowest price technically acceptable source selection process. So the government has two source selection methods that it can use. One method is lowest price technically acceptable, which essentially says, across all of the proposals that are received, if they're all technically, they all meet the technical requirements that are contained within the solicitation, the award decision is just going to be made on who provided the lowest cost. And then you have another type that allows the government to do it based on what's the best value to the government, and price doesn't necessarily have to be a deciding factor, though it's one amongst many. So here, to the extent that you're providing goods to the government that are expendable in nature, meaning they don't have a long shelf life, now the government is requiring or mandating that those types of contracts be procured based on lowest price technically acceptable. So depending on the types of goods you're providing to the government, it's important for you to know when you're providing a solicitation, now the government is essentially kind of mandating the source selection process that the contracting officer has to use. And so with the PGI language here, it's important to kind of be able to read and review what's that internal instruction that DoD is providing to the contracting officers for how to make that lowest price technically acceptable determination, or how to determine what goods are defined or considered expendable in nature. So if you want to know, well, I don't even know if, what I'm providing to the government would even meet this definition, the purpose of the PGI is for the PGI for DoD to provide those instructions to the contracting officer to help them make those decisions. So on the industry side, it's very important for you to know and understand how is the government contracting officer going to be making a decision as it relates to this good that I'm providing to the Department of Defense within my proposal. Next slide, please. And another recent one is related to non-availability of U.S. flag vessels for voyage and time charter. There's a requirement that you use a U.S. flag vessels for certain types of contracts. And to the extent that you can't find one, like there isn't any available, you're supposed to notify the government contracting officer. And so within this PGI, they're just instructing the government contracting officer of what email address to include in the solicitation for the contractor to provide that information. Next slide, please. And then this last most recent publication, we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, because I think this most recent one probably had the biggest impact on industry. And again, understanding the contracting officer's decision-making process and understanding the process that the contracting officer has to follow is very helpful and informative from an industry standpoint, because to the extent that you're providing information to the government, it allows you to tailor the language, the information, the documents to what the contracting officer is looking for. So you want to know what's the contracting officer looking for when they issue this solicitation or when they are making a certain determination, so that the information that you're providing them helps them to tell the story that they need to tell in order to support whatever type of determination or decision that you want them to make that's in your favor. So this is documentation related to commercial item determinations. Provides updated guidance for contracting officers on making and documenting a commercial item determination or a decision that an item is not commercial, and on use of the DoD commercial item database when they're making that decision. Why is this important for industry? There are lots of exceptions that are made for commercial items compared to other types of acquisitions. You know, government is allowed to use more streamlined acquisition procedures that more closely mirror how industry makes acquisitions. You know, there are exemptions for providing certified cost of pricing data. Cost accounting standards don't apply. So, you know, it's hugely beneficial to industry if I'm on the industry side of the house for whatever good or service that I'm providing to the government to be determined to be a commercial item, because it exempts me from having to meet a whole lot of other cumbersome government requirements. So when the contracting officer is reviewing something that I'm providing to them in order to make a commercial item determination, I need to know what criteria they're using so that I can help support them in making that decision. So again, we're going to talk through this one in a little more detail. Again, just to kind of understand what type of information is contained within the PGI to help contracting officers to either analyze different decisions that they have to make or other supplemental guidance that's provided to them. So this is a proposed rule, a proposed change that's coming, or that has already come, I'm sorry, to the PGI. Next slide, please. So within this document, it's showing the changes that have been made to existing text. So wherever you see the bolded text, that means that's new language that the Department of Defense is putting into place. And wherever you see bracketed bolded text, means it's new language. And then wherever you see the struck through text, that means it's language that the government is proposing to delete. So again, as I mentioned before, any changes or any language that's in the DFARS and DFARS PGI needs to be read in conjunction with the FAR. So if a change is being made within the PGI at part 12, you start at the FAR and then you kind of read it all the way through. So you have FAR part 12 that prescribes policies and procedures that are unique to the acquisition of commercial products, and it establishes acquisition policies that are more closely resemble commercial marketplace to encourage and it also encourages the acquisition of commercial products and commercial services. So again, it's trying to streamline acquisition processes, and it is guidance by the federal government to contracting officers to prefer commercial items over non-commercial items. So to the extent that the government has a commercial and a non-commercial item in front of it for consideration, it is directed to prefer that commercial item over the non-commercial. So again, that's why it's important that commercial item determination is very important from an industry standpoint. Next slide, please. And then here you have kind of the applicability language. So at FAR 12-102, you have, you know, this part is to be used for any supplier service that meets the definition of commercial product or commercial service. And then DFARS supplements that FAR language by saying, if the FAR is saying it has to meet the definition of commercial product or commercial service, within DoD, we want you to document that determination. So how do you know that it met the definition of commercial product or commercial service? Within DoD, we're going to require you to make a commercial item determination. And that commercial item determination has to be in writing, and it has to follow the procedures and guidance at PGI. Next slide, please. And so here's the PGI text that was contained in that recent publication. So the contracting officer now is, before making a commercial item determination, they have to go to this DoD commercial item database. And within that database, they need to review to determine whether or not a commercial item determination has already been made, either for or against the item. This, next slide, please. And within the commercial item determination, they have to, document market research that it is or is not commercial. They have to include it in the contract file. They have to include, part number, stock number, or both. And then they also have to include an actual determination or decision that the item does not meet the commercial item definition at FAR 2.101. Many times the government contracting officer relies on information provided by industry to support their commercial item determinations. So when the government contracting officer is conducting market research, it's important that the information that within industry is being provided to the contracting officer, that they're providing information to support. Why is this a commercial item? What other items are out there that are similar to and made available to the commercial marketplace? Even if your specific item is only provided to the government. So maybe, the government wants, brakes for a certain automobile or machine. And, the brakes that you're providing have been changed or modified or created to meet a government specific specification. Even though that's the case, you can still make the case it's a commercial item, because generally speaking, brakes are made available across the commercial marketplace. And even though modifications have been made to meet this specific government instance, it's not that specific instance that makes it a commercial item. It's what is the item generally used for? How is it generally used within the commercial marketplace? How generally available is the nature and type of item? So it's important within industry to be providing the government contracting officer with that supporting type information to help them make this determination that they have to include in the contract file and in that database. Next slide, please. And so again, within that commercial item database, they have to upload that signed document that it meets or that it doesn't meet it. And they're not supposed to upload any proprietary or controlled information. Next slide, please. And this is something that's allowing them to, again, use prior decisions that have been made. So to promote consistent acquisition procedures, they should be consulting within this new language that was incorporated within the PGI. The contracting officer is told to consult contracting activities that regularly procure the item to understand the basis for determining that the item does not meet the commercial item definition. So this again is where industry can step in to help. So if I know that the contracting officer is supposed to be, that they can rely on other commercial item determinations, they're not just making this determination in a silo. And I know I've already provided this item to GSA, for instance, or I've already provided this item to DoD Air Force, and now I have a solicitation with DoD Army. I don't need to, go through the whole rigmarole of trying to document and adequately show information if I've already had it determined by this other contracting officer within another agency or executive agency. I can point that contracting officer to the prior contracting officer that made a determination in order to help support the determination with this specific contracting officer that the decision has been made that it's a commercial item. So again, this is where it's helpful to kind of understand those internal procedures that the contracting officer within DoD is following, because we can support on the industry side of the house with providing information that's going to help support them making analysis that are hopefully in our favor. Next slide, please. And then here within PGI, it also provides reference to the DoD Guidebook for acquiring commercial items, which also could be helpful from an industry standpoint, again, to just know and understand how is the government making its decisions, what type of examples have been provided to that government contracting officer. So again, information that I'm providing to the government resembles what I know they're expecting to see to help, again, guide them in making decisions that support and favor my vantage point. Next slide, please. And this is just an example. So when you click that link on the slide before, this is the actual guidebook that the contracting officer will be pulling up. So again, this information is available not just to government folks, it's also available to industry folks to read and review, and I highly encourage you in doing that. Next slide, please. So that's the end of my presentation. Again, just wanted to not just go through kind of the PGI section by section, because I don't think that would be really helpful, but to just understand what is the PGI, you know, it's the guidance and information and that's available to contracting officers, how it's helpful to you as industry, where can you find changes as it's made on a daily basis, what types of changes are typically made. I walked through kind of the recent changes that were made, and why is it valuable to you to understand. If it's internal DoD procedures, why do I care? Well, you care because the information you're providing to the government, you need to ensure that you understand the decision-making process that the contracting officer is going to be going through when they're reviewing and assessing the information. It's almost like knowing the answers to the test before you take the test. If you understand what they're looking for, it helps you to tailor it to their needs. So I encourage all of you to get involved, read the FAR, DFARS, and PGI proposed interim and final publications that were on that site that I showed you before. And you can also find them here to see what changes are coming underway. You can also view public comments. So if there's a proposed change to the DFARS or DFARS PGI, you can get and see what's industry saying about there. There are a lot of industry associations where if they see a rule that's likely to have big impact across industry, they're gonna, you know, raise their voices and send something in to say, I agree with this, I don't agree with this, this is the huge impact that you didn't think about government. And so it's helpful if you want to kind of view and see what's industry saying and thinking about this change that's likely to come out. And then the status of open cases. The open cases these are changes that are coming down the pike. So from a preparation standpoint, it's really important to know what changes are coming so that you can prepare now, so that by the time the change hits the street and it's final, you've already done whatever internal modifications or changes or adjustments that are necessary to be compliant with that change. So that concludes my presentation. Jennifer, again, appreciate the opportunity to present. I'll turn it back over to you.
Janetta, this was great information. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your time, putting together a great presentation for our audience. And I think, like you said, it's very helpful and smart and wise to understand the rules, know what's coming out, and just how the system works if you are going to sell to DoD. So I think a better educated contractor makes a more successful contractor. And obviously there's certain roles within companies, your compliance folks, pricing, and I think C-level execs should be aware of this as well. So we will get the recording out to everybody, as well as the slides probably within the next 24 hours, probably shorter than that. Next week, we are going to dig into the FAR supplement on the Army on Wednesday, and then Friday will be the playbook on doing business with the Army. Both are complimentary webinars. You can sign up for those on our website under either the Playbook section or the FAR supplement section. So thank you again, Janetta. Thanks to everybody who joined us. And we hope that folks will join us again next week, again, as we cover the FAR supplement on the Army on Wednesday and the Playbook on Friday.